Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome at the Institute of Social Studies. My name is Leo de Haan. I'm director of the Institute. Of course, you've switched off your ringtone, and then please continue using the social media to report on what is happening here in the Institute. Most welcome. And of course, a special welcome both to Adam Habib and Jan Pronk. First of all, I want to introduce Adam Habib, Professor Adam Habib, professor in political science. And for his scholarly work, I invited him to the ISS to talk on his latest book. This is not a book launch, by the way. But still, the book is so interesting that I wanted him to talk about it. South Africa's Suspended Revolution. In a broader sense, Adam Habib is very well known for his work on political movements, democratization, and what we sometimes in literature called new social movements. So new types of social collectives, networks, multiple organizations that in that particular socio-political context work towards the achievement of certain elements and master to make coalitions that were sometimes unexpectedly effectful. So that is the main core of his work. He is also a university manager, perhaps I can say. Currently he is the Vice Chancellor of Wits University in South Africa, one of the oldest universities in the country, well known for his traditional, how would you say, attitude, which is more liberal than anything else, but also founded, established in the business sector in South Africa. He knows some very good examples of that at the moment. And before that, Adam Habib was Deputy Vice Chancellor in the University of Johannesburg. And many of you know that that university went through a tremendous transformation from, say, an Afrikaner university to an all South African university at the moment. And he was contributing from a research perspective to that wonderful transformation. And even before that, he worked in KwaZulu-Natal at the Human Science Research Council. And I always took him also as the first chairman of SAMPAD, the South African Netherlands program on alternatives in development. And he denied that. And that was a very nice bridge to Jan Pronk, who is in fact the founder of SAMPAD in the Netherlands. But Adam didn't deny any linkage with SAMPAD, but simply that he was the first chair. Of course, we all know he contributed a lot to the first years of SAMPAD's establishment in the Netherlands. And in South Africa, creating the network. Adam Habib is not only a scholar in the traditional sense, not only a university manager. I think he is my best example of a public scholar. An intellectual who combines professional interest with the social political commitment to the context in which he is working and engaging with it in order to try to improve it, at least to reflect upon it, and benefited from that respect to it in order to contribute to societal transformations. And his book, South Africa's Suspended Revolution, is, I think, a good example of that. It questions South Africa's transition, tries to explain that, tries to explain or reflect upon its institutional constraints, and try to point at a number of solutions. Of course, I won't go into that. I've asked him to take the book as a part of point of departure, but not to limit himself to the book. I mentioned already Jan Pronk. I've invited Jan Pronk to discuss it, to kick off our discussion, and of course then all time for you also to interfere with it, because Jan Pronk has a long-standing interest in South Africa. As I said, he established the South African Netherlands program on alternatives in development, and since then was very interested in stimulating collaborations between the Netherlands and South Africa. And so he will kick off the discussion, and when that all, after your input, has also been discussed, then I invite you for drinks in the atrium upstairs, and there you find an exhibit which we will officially launch and open here at ISS on South African-Dutch relationships in the period of the anti-apartheid boycott. And there is a lot to say about that as well. It's a very interesting exhibit which is both created by the South African Embassy here in the Netherlands and by the Netherlands Embassy in South Africa. So from here, I think it is September, October, it will also travel to South Africa. I think that is enough as an introduction. You came here to listen to Adam and not to me. So Adam Habib, please take the floor. It is yours. Welcome, Adam Habib, please.
Colleagues, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Leo. And it's lovely to have the opportunity to engage young on this panel. Let me greet you, friends, colleagues. I come from Wits, so I often greet people as comrades. So I hope you forgive me for that. It's really a wonderful opportunity to engage you and to have the opportunity to think with you some of the big issues that South Africa confronts, what the great successes are, what the big failures are, and what lessons need to be learnt in this regard. I also thought it's particularly useful to do so at a time when you're celebrating the anti-apartheid movement and the Dutch component of the anti-apartheid movement in particular. And I think it's particularly important that we have the opportunity, not only because we need to celebrate colleagues and comrades who have actually supported the struggle for democracy in South Africa, but also because I think that the anti-apartheid movement hasn't received the kinds of deliberation that it should have. And I think the lack of substantive deliberation on the principle of solidarity and how it was implemented in the anti-apartheid movement is something that could be very useful in the modern world. For me, one of the most fascinating things about the anti-apartheid movement was that the principle of solidarity and the way it was practiced enabled a historic alliance between natural allies, an alliance between human rights activists in the developed world and democratic nationalists in the developing world. And it was precisely that alliance that enabled the erosion of the legitimacy of the apartheid state and opening up the possibility for a democratic transition. And one of the big tragedies of the last 20 years is that alliance has broken in every major struggle around the world, whether you're looking at Burma, or whether you're looking at Zimbabwe, or whether you're looking at Darfur, or whether you're looking at Libya, or many of the other parts, and definitely in Syria. And for me, one of the things we need to learn is learn through the deliberations of the anti-apartheid movement. What was the practice of the principle of solidarity? And what are the lessons to be learned for other struggles in other conflict-ridden conflicts around the world? And it's something that I think we just haven't done sufficient deliberations on. I said earlier on that I think there's lots written on the anti-apartheid movement from a biographical point of view. There's lots written from a kind of simply descriptive point of view. But one of the big things that we haven't done sufficiently is think through the strategic engagements and how those strategic engagements enabled an alliance to emerge, and how that alliance was so necessary for building and creating a kind of global platform of struggle against authoritarian power. And I think we could learn a lot from that. So for me, doing and speaking at this moment when you're celebrating the anti-apartheid movement is a particular honor. And what I'm going to do is take the liberty of having been invited here to comment, at least right at the end, on that question. Because I think I'm going to speak about South Africa. I'm going to speak about the successes and failures. But I also want to speak, if you like, at the end about what that principle of solidarity meant and what I think are the lessons that need to be applied around the struggle and the contestation that is happening globally between the responsibility to protect and national sovereignty, and how the discourse has become, if you like, a dialogue of the deaf. Now, this is not completely foreign to the book, because the final chapter is a reflections on theory. And one of the things that it does engage with is this debate around the responsibility to protect a national sovereignty. And it actually makes the case for the necessity of reconstructing a historical alliance between human rights activists and democratic nationalists. And so I'll come back to that through a reflection, if you like, on Libya and perhaps even Syria as a means of concluding. Let me, however, I was invited to speak about South Africa, and let me revert back to South Africa and start on the assumption of trying to look at where South Africa stands 20 years after its transition, what the debates in South Africa are. As somebody asked me a while back, why did you write this book, and what is the book about, and how do you summarize it? And I said to them, the book says, what were the great successes and what were the big failures? How did we get to where we are, and how do we get out of the mess we're in? And that's what the book is about. So what I'm going to do is a couple of things. I'm going to tell you what I think are some of the successes. I'm going to speak about some of what I think is the big historic failure and the implications of the big historic failure. And then I want to talk about how I think we can get out of this challenge and what needs to happen as we move forward. And then I'll conclude, as I said, right at the end with some reflections on some of the big challenges globally and what lessons are to be learned. So let me start by talking about the debate in South Africa. And the debate in South Africa today is about what's been the great success and failures of the last 20 years. And you will see a number of colleagues have raised in the public discourse anyway, whether South Africa was better under apartheid than when it is now. And I must say, I think it's a crazy debate. It's an utterly crazy debate, and it's a particular debate that takes place in particular sectors. So Rampele raised it in relation to education, when she provocatively said, well, actually education under apartheid was better than it is in the post-apartheid period. And I'm almost convinced, knowing Mampele, that she didn't really mean it. That actually Mampele realized that if you want to rile up President Zuma, then you actually say life was better under apartheid. And you'll get the kinds of reactions and public discourse that happens. But I don't really believe that there is a real debate around this question. I mean, you just take simple things. 30 years ago, I would never have been able to leave South Africa. And if I managed to leave South Africa and give a lecture like this in The Hague, I either wouldn't be allowed back in South Africa, or if I landed in South Africa, I'd be locked up. We forget that. We take it for granted. We have Zapiro, right, drawing all of these cartoons about the shower and the president's head. The president gets annoyed by it. But Zapiro's never spent a day in jail. That's a fundamental difference between apartheid South Africa and contemporary South Africa. We've deracialized the public sphere in quite significant ways. The fact that I can be Vice Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand would never have been possible. Forget 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been possible. The fact now that we've doubled student enrollment into universities, and the fact that at least the vast majority of our students are black, is something that would never have been possible 30 years ago. The fact that we can deracialize the public sphere in this way, the fact that you can walk into Sandton, and if you ever have the opportunity to be in Sandton and walk into our malls, which are grotesque, I might add, but walk into our malls, and the fact that you'll see a white person buy a shoe for 5,000 rand, and then a black person can buy the shoe for 5,000 rand. It's not great. This thing, the kind of consumptionist attitudes breaks the racial divide. Now, we might be horrified by the fact of consumptionism, by the fact that it can happen beyond the racial divide. It's a fundamental change in South African society. So the fact is, South Africa is a fundamentally different, even in the much maligned education arena. You know, Mampele makes the point about life being, the statistics in apartheid South Africa in education were better. That's true. But that's because we didn't count black people under the statistical data. And the fact is that the vast majority of young black people were not allowed into schooling anyway, particularly in rural areas and in other sectors. So it is worth bearing in mind that even today in South Africa, that if you look at enrollment data, something like 95, 96% of young grade 5s and 6s get enrolled into school. Those statistics are close to what exists in Western Europe. Now, it's true that in the next 10 years or 12 years, we do a horrendous job for the vast majority of those students. But the fact that they can get access to education and enter grade 1 is now a fundamental change from what existed in apartheid. Now, it's also true that we will lose 50% of them in the next 12 years, and 50% of them will not complete. And we need to challenge that, and we need to be critical of that, and we need to... But you can't make an easy comparison that life was better under apartheid than now. It's too easy. You're not looking at the right data. You're comparing other different things, apples and pears. And that's something that you shouldn't be doing. So between you and me, I think it's a crazy debate. And I think it's useful to put that debate aside. Even in the economy, let me add, everybody's talking about the economy now and how disastrous things are on the economic level. Just let me give you the data. We have never achieved growth rates in our history for this long a period. So between 1994 and 2013, we had a single year of recession. In every other single period, we've never had growth rates for this long in South African history. Now, it is true that we have a problem with growth, that growth is not big enough, that on average it was sitting at about 2-3% over the last 20 years. And clearly you need 5 or 6 or 7% to address our social challenges. But the fact that you've had growth is something that's worth bearing in mind. So, I think when people engage in this debate about whether South Africa was better under apartheid or not, we just need to look at a few simplistic data and then just simple data and just put it aside. I think it's a nonsensical debate, and it's worth saying that. Having said that, that doesn't mean that they aren't huge challenges. They are fundamentally big challenges that we confront in South Africa. And I would argue that the Achilles heel of South Africa's transition is the growth in inequality. That actually, ironically, while we've had growth for 19 out of 20 years, our economic inequalities have grown exactly every single year for 20 years. We entered our democratic transition as the second most unequal society in the world. And we have the dubious honor of having overtaken Brazil in about 2007, 2008 to become the most unequal society in the world. And what is shocking is that we've done this in the midst of a democratic transition. And what that has done is it's particularly polarized society and created an enormous amount of social pathologies that South African society is grappling with. My big fear about this, by the way, is that I don't believe we understand and we take inequality seriously. And it seems to me that there are really 3 views that prevail in South Africa, but it seems to me globally, around the challenge of inequality. There is a view that suggests, and it's very prevalent in corporate South Africa, particularly amongst the economists, is that don't worry about inequality. Inequality is a necessary condition of modern economics. That's the big argument of corporate South Africa. The second view is that inequality is a problem, but we need to address it by tackling poverty. And I'll come to that in a minute. And I think that that's just seriously problematic. Let me take the first point, that inequality is a necessary condition of modern economics. Firstly, I don't think that that's true. But I think that even if you believed it, what it doesn't recognize is the political circumstances and the political consequences of economic inequality. what those economists in the corporate sector have not understood is that what highly unequal societies do is they do what political scientists and sociologists have called 30 years ago, what it creates is political deprivation. What you have in the society, in highly unequal societies, is the society politically polarizes. And it is this political polarization that creates a whole series of social pathologies: violent crime, child and woman abuse, the kinds of political polarization in the political system, the violent service delivery and wage strikes, and the counter reactions to that. It kind of politically polarizes the society. And the challenge with the politically polarized society is that it doesn't create the social conditions and the economic conditions for political stability. And if you don't have the conditions for political stability, you never get the kinds of investment patterns required to achieve growth. So highly unequal societies actually are not good for growth itself. And there is a number of financial economists, particularly in the Financial Times and other places, Wolf and others, who've begun to increasingly make this point, that highly unequal societies is not even good for growth itself, and that simply by growing, you cannot simply address the economic inequalities in the society. And so I'm skeptical about what is the kind of traditional economist corporate logic, which is that inequality is a necessary condition of modern economics. That actually the danger with that is, whether you like it or not, it's never going to allow us to heal. It's never going to allow us to create the kinds of social conditions to achieve economic stability or even economic growth in the society. Because one of the things that those economists don't understand is the importance of context. And so, yes, it's true that inequalities have been growing across the world. But when they grow in the middle of the Netherlands, its manifestations are fundamentally different to when they grow in the middle of South Africa. In South Africa, 3 months ago, a child died by falling and drowning in feces. I just want to give you this. In one of the most richest societies in the world, in one of the societies in the dawn of the 21st century, a child of 5 years old fell and drowned in feces. This would never, if that had happened in the middle of the Netherlands, not only would the government fall, every single government for the next 10 years would fall. In South Africa, it didn't do anything. It reached the national newspapers, and some people grumbled about the nature of inequality, but that's the consequence of inequality in our society. And that's the conditions for the kinds of social pathologies that emerge as a result of inequality in the society. And so, for me, to come back to this debate on inequality, I think that the corporate economists are simply wrong. The second view recognizes that inequality is a problem and that we need to address this. But what it does is it doesn't know how to address it. And so what they do is, the way they suggest you address it is by just dealing with poverty and focusing on growth. And the argument is that if you get growth going in the society and in the economy, you'll start dealing with poverty, and as you deal with poverty, you deal with inequality. And I think this is frankly both philosophically and empirically wrong. Philosophically and empirically, it's been proven wrong globally by this fascinating book by Thomas Piketty. What was it? Capital in the 21st Century. And what basically Thomas Piketty makes the point is that actually, that if you look at the data over the last 200-300 years, that what you effectively see is that if you have actually growth and if you deal with this thing, actually it doesn't automatically erode inequality. That the only reason it is seen to erode inequality is because much of the data is focused between 1913 and 1970s. And that what happened and eroded the inequality is the emergence of 2 world wars. And 2 world wars dealt and took and destroyed wealth in quite a significant scale of the rich. And it is precisely that destruction that brought inequality levels down. It wasn't the economics of it that actually brought the inequality level down. And he actually argues and makes the case in very persuasive ways, I think, of why growth on its own simply feeds into economic inequality, and he looks at data over a long period of time, but he makes the argument that there are two sets of issues that drive it. The one is shareholder wealth, and how shareholder returns on stock exchanges tend to outpace the growth in the economy, and you see that now. You just look at what's happening in South Africa. We're heading for a 15 to 20% growth on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange in a context where the economy is in a major crisis and the platinum industry has been utterly devastated. We have a case where we've had the largest and biggest strike in platinum, and all of the three companies that have been basically confronting the longest mining strike in history, their stock market shares have actually increased over the last period of time. And that's the kind of crazy disjuncture that is emerging between markets and the economy itself. The second, of course, he speaks about executive remuneration and how remuneration of executives has fueled and increased economic inequalities in the modern world. But in South Africa, the argument has been there for some time now, as it has in other parts of the world, but there's significant empirical cases why. In South Africa, we've had growth. I've demonstrated in the last 19 out of 20 years. The growth has been largely between 2.8 and 3% in average. Sometimes some years we reach 5.5%. But one of the most striking things is we've brought down poverty quite significantly, largely because of the proper engagement in social support grants. But inequality has grown every single year. And the same story is India, the same story is China, and I can give you multiple other examples where this is the one exception, although the big sustainability of the project is in question, is Brazil, where actually there has been a decline in economic inequalities, and I'm happy to discuss what I think are the big variables that enable that to happen in the Brazilian case. And so for me, the question is, the second view is just as problematic. But the problem is the second view is not simply at the heart of the corporate sector. It is a prevailing view at the heart of the state itself. And I really want to discuss the National Development Plan here because I think that that's exactly where the challenge lies. There is much that is spoken about the National Development Plan, and it's got the support of all major sectors. And I think that there is much that is positive about the National Development Plan around corruption, around educational policy. Its education chapter is particularly sound. There's a very, very powerful chapter around the health sector and a whole range of, and there was a very strong chapter around administrative reforms. But I think that the fundamental economic question of South Africa has been ducked by the National Development Plan. And the problem is that it gets masked by Irvin Jim from NUMSA, who kind of makes the critique and then makes it in such extreme, crazy ways that the kind of sanity of the debate gets marked out. But this is the dilemma of the National Development Plan on the economy. What it says in the policy, in the chapter on the economy, is that the way you deal with, we need to address inequality because inequality is polarizing our society. So it recognizes the problem. It says we have to bring it down, and the way we're going to bring it down is by getting growth and dealing with poverty. And so how does it do it? It makes a series of suggestions: education reform, skills transfer, and skills mobility, a massive infrastructural investment, massive industrialization strategy that absorbs low-skilled workers, and particularly in labor-intensive sectors, broad-based BEE, resources and legal reform for small business enterprises. It makes a whole series of reforms, all of which I have no problem with. I think they make a lot of eminent sense. But this is the dilemma of the National Development Plan. As you deal with that and as you get employment going, you get growth growing in the economy. And that works. And that's fantastic. But as you deal with growth in the economy, you also deal with poverty. But that doesn't mean you deal with inequality. Because the guys on the top, people like me, are people who have some things that the guys at the bottom don't have. We have stocks, we have bonds, we have pension funds, we have property. And as the economy starts growing, these guys on the top grow faster than the guys at the bottom because it is precisely the prevalence of assets on the top that allows them to grow faster. So as you have poverty alleviation, you have economic inequality growth simultaneously. And that's the dilemma of the challenge of the National Development Plan. And by the way, the National NPC, the commissioners know this. They know this. I can tell you, I have had conversations with them. And they will admit to you quietly that that is a dilemma. But it's a political challenge on how you actually do this. You want to win the corporate sector, you want all of these people, you want to get them around a common program. It's hard to win the case. But we're lying to ourselves, because getting all of these policies going is not going to bring down inequality. And if you see inequality as a contributing factor to the political polarization, then you've got a major challenge in the society. And so the question is, how do we deal with this thing? And there's only two ways to deal with it. The one, in any economy, if you want to bring down inequality, you need to get the guys at the bottom grow faster than the guys on the top. Or you need to hold the guys on the top down so the guys at the bottom come up. That's how inequality comes down. And you need to look at it in historical examples of how that happens. And so there's two ways that it happens. One is executive remuneration and reform around executive remuneration. Basically, it means you tell rich people, sorry, Jack, life is hard. You're going to take a remuneration amnesty for the next 3 or 5 years. How you politically sell that is a different question. But frankly, you're going to have to sell it, because if you can't sell that, you're in serious trouble. That means telling cabinet ministers, no salary increases or below inflationary increases over the next couple of years. But it's not only cabinet ministers. You've got to tell the CEOs of the Fortune 500 of the Fortune top 40 companies on the JSE exactly the same thing. Because if you don't do that, that's this thing. Your other mechanism is to look at the Brazilian model. And the Brazilian model did the following. It basically used its development finance institutions, poured large monies into the development finance institutions, and used that money to bankroll the informal sector and to formalize the informal sector. So it's not the Bolsa Familia grant that pulls it off. I think that that was important. But the real trick is how you mainstreamed a number of companies in the informal sector and pushed them into the formal sector and sparked out employment growth. And what you did is you forced growth at the bottom end rather than the top end. And it seems to me that that's the real debate we should have. Now, I'm not saying that these are solutions for South Africa. I am saying we have to grapple with the reality that simply inequality is not going to, you're not going to deal with it without dealing with poverty. And that you have to grapple with that and look at historical examples where inequality was brought down. Western Europe is an example. Southeast Asia is an example. But it happened in a different historical epoch, in a world where you had a bifurcated global system. That may not be applicable, but we need to learn lessons from that. We need to understand the Brazilian model. And we need to bring and think through, how do you get growth going with inequality reduction? Because if we don't do that, we don't deal with the political polarization. And if we don't deal with the political polarization, you don't deal with the challenge of Marikana and the service delivery protest. And if you don't deal with that, you don't deal with political stability and investor appetite. And that's the challenge and the developmental challenge of South Africa. So the question is, what do we do going forward? And this is the real big question. You know, it might sound as if I'm pessimistic about South Africa. Actually, I'm quite optimistic. I think we're on the way to getting it right, actually, ironically. And I'll tell you why I think that in a minute. But if I was asked, and I won't be, I can tell you, but if I was asked by the president, what would you do in the next 3 or 4 years, and what should be the political project, I would say 3 things. I would say first, you need a social pact. And by the way, you need the social pact starting in the ANC, because it's factionalized, and in this thing. And then secondly, you need the social pact in the society. At the moment, what you have is Rob Davies and Ibrahim Patel on the one hand, Praveen Gordhan and Nene on the other. And what do? They argue from 2 different economic logics. Now, those are not mutually exclusive, as you saw in the Netherlands, or as you saw in Ireland, or as you saw in large parts of the developing world, including Brazil. But what it requires is actually somebody smacking them on the heads and bringing them together and saying, what are the trade-offs to be made? And frankly, we haven't had that. And until now, that hasn't happened. And if you don't have that, well, you can't start singing from the same hymn sheets. And the problem is we don't sing from the same hymn, we sing some separate hymnships, and that creates even more stability. So the first thing that I would do is try to create leadership within the party and within the state. Firstly, to start understanding the trade-offs. And there's multiple trade-offs you can have. On the LRA, the business sector is crazy if they think we're going to simply get rid of the LRA. Even if you thought that was a good thing, which I don't think it is, you're never going to succeed. You think COSATU, after fighting for 50 years, at least it and its predecessors are going to say, okay, get rid of the Labor Relations Act, which provides a whole series of minimum conditions. You'd have to destroy it. To destroy COSATU would mean civil war. It's a crazy plan. So the question is, even if you believe that, the question is, what do you do? Well, you cut a deal. And that means that in certain sectors, agriculture, textiles, young people, you say that you need to weaken some of the provisions, provided you don't do so from in the labor market as a whole. That's a possible conversation. I had a conversation with the COSATU CEC about a year and a half ago around the youth wage subsidy. And I said to them, and Evan Jim was there. And I said, explain to me, what is this crazy debate about the youth subsidy? Because frankly, you are worried about the youth subsidy, that people will employ young people and then get rid of established workers. There's a simple way to resolve that. You count the number of workers in an industry or in a factory or in a corporate, and you say, while you accessing the youth wage subsidy, you're not allowed to get rid of those workers. It's a very simple thing. Political computer science, one students can do this, and write an algorithm for this in WITS in a half an hour. But we have this crazy debate about the youth wage subsidy and this thing as if these are mutually exclusive. That's the problem. We have the debate about whether it's capitalism versus socialism, when the real answer is about the nuances in between, the shades of gray in between. And that's the challenge that it seems to me that we have to have. So the first thing that I would do is get everybody singing, understanding the trade-offs and singing from the first hymn sheet. Second is you need to establish that pact in the broader society, which means bringing in business labor in the state. And frankly, you need to have that conversation in a serious way. And if you're going to seriously impact on perceptions in the society, because what's driving protest, what's driving violent protest, but whether in Marikana or in the service delivery protest, is a backlash against inequality. And to address that, what you need to address is perceptions. To address perceptions in the society, what you have to effectively do is say, you have to moderate rich people's expectations. You can't moderate poor people's expectations unless you start with rich people. You want to say to poor people, give us time, be patient, give us 5 years. Well, you have to start putting something on the table as rich people. And that means you have to put executive remuneration on the cards. You have to put. Now, economists say to you, but asking the CEO of Implats in the platinum belt not to take a salary it doesn't impact on the balance sheet. It doesn't matter. It's symbolically important for impacting on perceptions. You want to convince workers on the platinum belt to be reasonable, you have to ask the CEO to start putting something on the table, because that's symbolically important to moderate expectations in the sector as a whole. And so you're going to have to force them. You have to engage them and create the pact in the broader system as well. Once you've done that, it seems to me there's a second part. You need a policy agenda that is able to be transient, but with the future focus. And so for me, that's the interesting thing. 30% of South African society is unskilled or semi-skilled. You can't wish it away. It's the challenge of our history. The question is, what do you do about it? Now, you can either leave them sitting and smoking weed and cigarettes in the corner, which means that they're seriously pissed off. Or you say to them, excuse me, what you need to do is you need to include them into the project. And the only way you can include them is by giving them jobs. And if you're going to give them jobs, it has to be in areas where there's low skills. Because you're never going to give them 5 months of training and suddenly expect them to work as IT entrepreneurs. So you have to grow labor-intensive sectors like agriculture, textiles, construction, even service sectors like tourism. That's what you have to do. And you have to incorporate them into that. And then and you're going to have to there's going to be all kinds of concessions required from labor, salary, from labor and conditions, from big business, the question of tariffs. You're never going to be competing successfully in the textile sector with China around. It's not going to happen. So what you're going to have to do is look at around tariffs. The question is, how's the balance struck? And yes, prices will go up within reason, and you have to take that into account. And then as you move down, and what you promise these people who get employed in this sector, that what you'll make sure is their young people, their children, get an option at the jobs they want. The engineers, the doctors, the lawyers, the kinds of middle class service related jobs. And that means getting education working, getting schooling working, dealing with the challenge of maths and science, dealing with the practical problems around those issues. That's what it means. And that's what you're going to grapple with. Because if you don't do that, you're never going to get out of it. And then as you move on, you gravitate outside these labor-intensive sectors and grow into the kinds of sectors that you need to. That's the historical development challenge around it. Now the question is this likely, and why am I optimistic that this will happen? Well, 2 reasons. One, frankly, politicians never deliver anywhere in the world. They only deliver when the system makes them deliver. That's the logic of accountability. Accountability in a democracy happens when there's a threat that politicians will lose office. Because it is the threat of losing office that creates the accountability dynamic in a democracy. The second is that the one thing to make politicians responsive to citizens is if you give citizens power. This is the development dilemma. If you can figure out how to give poor people power, you create the sustainable basis for development. Because it is precisely that power that will make them politicians accountable to those people. And so poor people get power through 2 ways. 1, through social mobilization and social collective action. And 2, when politicians are divided and there's a threat of them losing office. Now, that doesn't exist immediately in South Africa. The ANC's latest election, it won 62%. However, in Johannesburg, it fell to 53. In Nelson Mandela, it fell to 48. In Tswana and Ekululeni, it's in the low 50s, probably 50, I think, in Ekululeni. Ha-ha! For the first time, the ANC is really shaken up. And that's good, because it forces it to become responsive to people. It lost 11%, by the way, in Gauteng. You know who that 11% went to? It went to the EFF. That's the interesting thing. The DA has to ask itself, why is it that poor people don't vote for it? That they'll rather vote for Julius Malema than vote for Helen Zille. And I'll tell you the answer to that. Is because what happens is that Helen Zille is seen not to care for poor people. That's the dilemma. You want to give a symbolic reflection of this? I'll tell you. When Marikana happened, anywhere in the world, if Marikana had happened, the opposition parties would have been there in 24 hours, right? They would have been there saying this is this thing. Helen Zille was nowhere to be seen. She was far away from Marikana. Julius Malema went to Marikana. Helen Zille didn't. That is the symbolic message that was sent out by the DA on that day. Was, we're not into the business of poor people and representing their interests. That's the historical challenge of South Africa in this context. So for me, the fact that they've fallen is I think, in the urban areas, is important because it creates the accountability dynamic. But there's something else that is creating that accountability dynamic. And that is this much maligned urban gym. Because NUMSA for the first time is saying, we're going to jump. We're thinking about pulling out. Now, it doesn't matter whether you agree with NUMSA or not. The really interesting thing about NUMSA is that it creates the accountability dynamic, because what it is it's competing for the electoral gap which is on the left of the ANC. And if it competes and it threatens and eats the votes of the ANC, that forces the ANC to become responsive to citizens so that it can keep those votes. And it is that dynamic that I think creates the possible potential for the possibility for us moving forward. And I think that's the one reason why I'm optimistic. There's a second. I think it doesn't matter what South Africa does, bar the stupid, the utterly stupid. We do a lot of the stupid stuff, but the utterly stupid we haven't got to yet. But Africa is growing. 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. And as Africa goes, given the fact that South African firms are so integrally located to the African continent, they're going to drag us along. So despite what we do, we're going to grow. Now, the sad thing is that we could grow so much better. We could grow so much inclusively. We could be much more effective, both for South Africa and the continent, if we did that with a bit of foresight. But it seems to me that South Africa, in part, is going to grow. And that, in part, is why I'm particularly optimistic, both for the growth potential of Africa and particularly for the accountability dynamic re-emerging in the place. Let me end by focusing a little on, and in the last 5 minutes, on the issue of foreign policy. And I want to end because I think this is important for how we debate our future challenges. I said to you right at the beginning, the real lesson of the anti-apartheid movement was that it formulated at its heart, at its inner soul, the historic alliance between democratic nationalists and human rights activists in the developed world. And that was by the way it practiced the principle of solidarity. And that historic alliance was fundamental to the erosion of the anti-apartheid movement and the erosion of the apartheid state and the opening up of the democratic transition. And that, frankly, what has happened subsequently to that, whether you're looking at Libya or Syria or Zimbabwe or Burma, that historic alliance has fractured. And that historic alliance has fractured because on the one hand, you've got democratic nationalists are worried about the principle of sovereignty. And you've got human rights activists who are saying, when people are dying, are being killed by autocrats, you intervene. And what we've got is into a false debate between one or the other. But both democracy and development, and South Africa proves this point, is you can't do one or the other. It's doing the both simultaneously that is the real trick. And that's the fundamental question that we've got to start confronting. In a lot of ways, I've said this in South Africa, the real task of our conflict-ridden areas, whether it's Syria or Libya, is how do you avoid Iraq and Rwanda simultaneously? Because if you do the one or the other, that undermines the very democracy and development that you're talking about. And it's important that both democratic nationalists and human rights activists move. Because if you simply look at the right to the responsibility to protect without understanding and looking at the sovereignty question, you can implicitly become the unwitting agent of imperial power. And that's what has happened in so many contexts. And with quite dramatic impacts, like that happened in Libya, where you create power vacuums, you have the emergence of ethnic rivalries, you have all of the kinds of challenges there. On the other hand, the democratic nationalists have to start saying sovereignty has to be adaptable. That you cannot utilize, and this is the big challenge of Mahmoud Mamdani's work. I think it's a wonderful work. He puts forward the importance of survivor's justice as opposed to victor's justice a la Nuremberg. But what he forgets implicitly in practice is that you can fall into the logic of letting the autocrat get away. The real lesson of South Africa, by the way, is not that the autocrat didn't get away. There were consequences. Now, there might not be the consequences of hanging the guy, but P.W. Botha died a miserable man in the middle of George. He was a very, very unhappy person. Now, ideally, I would have loved the bloody guy to hang. But that would not have been possible because given the political power and the conditions there. So concessions were made. But there were consequences for the individual. And so the question is, how do you strike consequences? How are you pragmatic? But how do you move forward? So I think, for instance, on Zimbabwe, on Libya, I actually think that Jacob Zuma's position on the political solution was not wrong. I think if he had gone, he implemented it badly, and the African Union collapsed. But I think if Jacob Zuma had gone to Gaddafi and said, you see those guys in NATO, I can make those bombs stop. But you need to do A, B, and C, and D, and use that as leverage to force a political solution, that may have been possible. But what happened? A fractured debate between NATO on the one hand and the democratic nationalists on the African continent. And so we had a false debate between sovereignty and the responsibility to protect. I'm quite clear. An intervention was necessary. I supported resolution, what was it called from the UN? 1972. 1970. Yeah. So that resolution, I supported it. But the idea was to create the stalemate. And once the stalemate was created, a political solution should have been put. And if we were singing from the same hymn sheet, that was possible. But a false debate emerged. And a debate emerged between human rights activists on the one hand, saying the responsibility to protect and being sanguine about the notion of sovereignty. You see, if you're living in the empire, and you can be sanguine about sovereignty. But if you're living in the colony that has been the victim of empire, sovereignty is important, even in difficult contexts. The question is, how do you do the two better? In Burma, I suggested that the South African government was wrong when it defended Burma in the UN. What I suggested it should have done is it should have said in the Security Council, we think that this should not be tabled here. And then in a big drama, together with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, together with the world's media, it should have jumped on a plane, flew into Geneva, and made a big issue in the Human Rights Council. Now, would that have changed Burma? No. But would it have changed the global debate on the consequences? Yes. That's the problem with the way we're having our debate. Because if you see this either as one or the other, we are in singular problems. I looked at Zimbabwe. And I said, in Zimbabwe, if you want to take seriously, is Mugabe an autocrat? Of course he is. The question is, what the hell do you do? And what leverage do you get? Is regime change feasible? Well, I'd be skeptical. South Africa's tried it. It tried to buy a whole series of ZANU-PF. Shouldn't tell you that. Tried to buy a whole series of ZANU-PF individuals to try and do a palace coup. It didn't work in 2002, 2003. The real question is, what is the leverage do you get against an autocrat? One leverage that I had suggested is if you could unite Southern Africa, you could close Zimbabwe's airspace. But the danger is you have to unite all of the buggers, because if you have one that doesn't, that airspace logic is broken in exchange for A, B, C, and D. Those are the kinds of debates we should be having, rather than the false debate. Responsibility, protect, sovereignty, as if these are mutually exclusive. The democratic project is fundamentally about bring both together, at least in this world. When we achieve a world government, then we can talk about other mechanisms. But for now, that's the historical challenge. And it seems to me that the real debate, ending off, is this. How do you reconstruct the strategic alliance between what should be natural allies, democratic nationalists and human rights activists? And the challenge of Syria, the challenge of Libya, the challenge of Burma, and the challenge of Zimbabwe and Darfur is precisely that strategic alliance has fractured. The great struggle of the anti-apartheid movement was through the practice of the principle of solidarity. They were able to forge that strategic alliance, which made that possible. And that's the fundamental debate, I think, that should be at the heart and at the core of the debate around the responsibility to protect. And that's the debate I don't hear. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Adam, for also the enthusiastic way you presented your arguments. We're used to you doing that, but it still brings us alive. And thank you also for extending the argument a bit beyond South Africa. I would like to give the floor to Jan Pronk. Jan, would you like to sit, to stand, or to walk?
Exactly. No.
Well, we know you are quite an enthusiastic walker as well.
Yeah, sure, but I have some notes. Thank you, Adam. I read the whole book, and your speech was very strongly based on the line of argument in the book, and I read it last couple of weeks with a question in mind. To which extent can we learn from the experience of South Africa after apartheid, in particular now that we are in the middle of discussions about future development agenda post-2015. And in the preparations of that post-2015 development agenda, you see that issues which you are mentioning as core issues are back on the international agenda. There's equality. And to that extent, of course, it is important that the book by Piketty has been published now recently about inequality. And equality issues were, of course, on the agenda of development economists already for decades, but equality issues are now also on the agenda of the post-2015 agenda. They were not on the Millennium Development Agenda. And secondly, say, rights-based development, human rights-based development, human rights, for which, of course, in the discussion at the moment, questions such as democracy are again on the agenda. Now that augurs well. Whether the outcome will be in accordance with these two priorities for the next agenda is still to be questioned, but that depends on the process. Now, what can we learn from South Africa? You are known as a radical thinker, and I read it also to that extent. And in the beginning of the book, you quote Edward Said, "Speaking truth to power." That's what you did. You did it in the book even more than here today. It's a beautiful, long quote on your attitude with regard to the present leadership, which I'd love to quote, but it's a little bit too long. But it's extremely critical. Speaking truth to power. At the same time, you are nuanced. Reading through the whole book, your analysis is extremely critical, but your proposals are very reasonable. And that makes you indeed, what you say yourself, an academic and also an activist working within the system that you also made clear. You came in the book with a number of suggestions and proposals which sometimes brought me to the annotation in my notes, wishful thinking. Will it really be possible? And I'm saying that not as an academic, but also as somebody with a lot of political experience, wishful thinking. And you've added to these specific policy proposals which could be applied now a greater degree of optimism than you did display in the book. Fair? A greater degree of optimism. And you base your optimism, listening to your statement today, on three basic arguments. Firstly, the possibility that the leadership, which you criticize, will be more accountable in a basically democratic system than today. That's one reason to be optimistic. Secondly, South Africa, its economic development anyway will benefit from economic growth in Africa as a whole, and there is economic growth in Africa as a whole. Africa rising, some development economists say at the moment. And thirdly, and that was related to the last part of your statement, there are possibilities and alternatives in the international framework, in the international political setting, which you can try to make the reality, as against the extremely bad present international policies with regard to, for instance, the examples which you also elaborating in the book, and which I agree fully with on Syria, Libya, etc. Is that optimism legitimate? When I look at the world as a whole, I see that everywhere in the world, politicians are becoming less accountable. Everywhere. You speak for yourself. Let me say, I can say so for Holland. I see it also in the United States. I see that in Middle Eastern countries, in African countries, there are hardly any exception. Everywhere, less accountability because of the shape and content of the democratic system everywhere in the world. So does that justify optimism? Secondly, indeed, there's growth in African countries. But that is exactly the same type of growth which South Africa has gone through during the last 15 years, which you are depicting very well. You are explaining how there was change from a very neoliberal approach in the beginning of the middle 1990s through Mbeki, and then gradually becoming more neo-Keynesian, and then gradually more interest in public investment policies, for instance in infrastructure, even the inclusion of the full employment objective in the mandate of the central bank, quite something. Huh? But despite everything, you do say in the book that inequality, poverty and unemployment is the Achilles heel, the main issue. So despite changes in economic and social policies within the country, this still is the case, increasing inequality. You comment on a number of very interesting authors who have tried to analyze this. And you say, well, they have different views. If I read your summaries of those analysts, I come to the conclusion that they more or less were in agreement with each other with some differences. And they finally came to the conclusion that because of this very specific political character of the process, there was not a situation which was better or worse than apartheid, but it was a kind of a continuation of apartheid. There was a kind of a self-interest of some specific leading classes in South Africa, which gradually was directing South Africa into the direction of the acceptance of anti-apartheid and of democracy. However, that was seen as serving their own interests. They could continue just like they did in the past. But there is a difference of view between on who did really benefit and who really was the victim, and that is flowing to a certain, but it's clear inequalities have increased. That's exactly the same in Nigeria. It's exactly the same in Kenya. There is no other African country which is going through a different phase. Maybe Botswana. But all those other examples are exemptions. So if you are hoping that South Africa will be able to benefit from that type of growth, I'm afraid that the answer is participating in that process will just confirm further inequalities. And as a matter of fact, look to Europe and the US. We are doing away with the social welfare state exactly in the same way. In the US, you know, it's extremely unequal, and I'm also less positive about the Brazilian example which you did give. So that is the second reason why I am afraid that the optimism is not justified. And the third reason you gave, I am afraid that the examples of Libya, etc., are no exceptions. We have more or less weakened, torn down the system within which we could argue and perhaps also help to implement a different international economic policy, and the system of the United Nations now more and more, including all the other elements of the family system of the United Nations, is more and more in favor of, well, the views of that particular upper class in the world, in some specific countries, with all those allies somewhere else, which will continue to follow exactly the same policies which you are criticizing with regard to Libya. Is there an alternative? In your book you said, well, there are alternatives. maybe not many, but you're fair. You come with very specific proposals how to do so. You bring them now here together in one term, and that is the social pact. And in the book, you're going further. The social pact would also imply a stronger reliance on public policy making than on the market. Yes, but is it in the making? Where? In any country? It should be an end to the self-enrichment and corruption prevailing amongst the elite. Yes, but where at the moment? Inclusive development policies, stronger civil society movements. Everywhere the civil society movements are getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Well, the NGOs are becoming stronger, but they are just firms and they are no movements whatsoever. You're deepening democratization, you say, and a stronger political opposition. Everywhere the oppositions, the democratization processes are at the moment being eroded. You ask yourself the question, that's very interesting. You ask yourself the question, is it possible in a situation of transformation, you went through that, to achieve democracy and social justice at the same time? And that's, of course, the core issue, both. It's related also to the global agenda post-2015, social justice and democracy, accountability and equality, whatever. Is it possible? You have achieved a lot of democracy, and the beginning was clear. And that is indeed a major step forward, but less social justice. In the book, and I didn't see that before, but you helped me. In the book, you say, well, that may be true due to the fact that those who were accepting the change would do so because they were less hostile to democracy than that they were hostile to social justice, because they always will be able to manipulate democracy if and when established through corruption, I'm quoting you, through corruption and economic power. That's what they can manipulate, and they cannot easily manipulate an established economic and social structures which are being considered as just by the population, and then if they are considered as just by the population, they will fight for it. I think that's true. And I think it is possible at a certain moment to bring the two together. However, then you need time. You have only had 20 years. You point to Europe. We had centuries. And as a matter of fact, after 1850, we went into the inequality, violation of human rights direction, and after the Second World War, we all of a sudden went into the other direction, social welfare state, more democratization, etc. So it took us centuries, or at least 150 years after a specific moment. That's what it needs. And the question is, of course, do we grant each other in the world such a long... I think you need such a long period. And that's also the reason why you shouldn't criticize many developing countries for not yet reaching more democracy and more equality and better inclusive development. They need a longer period. But do we grant each other a longer period if there are interests in the international global system of economic interests which do not wish to go for more democracy and do not wish to go for social justice? Piketty comes with the need to have more equality. And you argue that there are two basic views in South Africa, and which is true for the world as a whole, and also it was true for discussions of development economy. Inequality doesn't matter because there will be growth anyway, so at a certain moment. And you rightly say, well, it does matter, because inequality breeds polarization, and polarization breeds worse conditions for stability, and if there is instability, there won't be investment from outside. I think all the first steps are right, but I wonder whether the last step is right as well. I don't think that world powerful companies care much about inequality or instability in a specific country, because their power is going to be protected by governments behind them. For instance, with the means of all types of international investment. They don't care much about inequality and poverty because they do not need the consumers within the country. It's all export oriented, and there is enough purchasing power also. And that means that perhaps all those questions with regards to what's going on in a specific country will be much more difficult to be answered because of the global power within which the policy space of individual countries such as South Africa is much narrower than it used to be in the past. Finally, and I do not want to say much about the apartheid, anti-apartheid solidarity movement of the past. You have a long chapter also. What can we do from South Africa in other countries? Bring together human rights, sovereignty of the nation state, and redress of the past. Can you do something from outside? There are many people in your own country who say, well, it's hardly possible, and you are much more in favor. At the same time, of course, you got an answer from those people who said, well, whatever we do at a certain moment, there is change, but the new leaders in those countries are as bad as the previous leaders. Why are we doing it? That is quite a difficult question to be answered. And that is true, I think, for many countries in Asia, Africa. There are possibilities. It can never be done by intervention at the government-to-government level. You pointed to the need that it also ought to be solidarity, cooperation at the ground level between civil society movements. ANC was a civil society movement. The anti-apartheid movement in Western Europe and the US was also a civil society movement. It helped, yes? It helped those groups within South Africa to go for change within the country. It is always necessary to do it within and from outside. That's perhaps also the way in which it worked with regard to change before the end of the Cold War in Central and Eastern European countries. However, we do not see anymore at the moment a groundswell solidarity movement. We only see at the moment movements at the top. And movements at the top, I'm afraid, will never result in more equality and more democratic accountability. For that reason, I am quite pessimistic, maybe more pessimistic than you, but you point into the right direction. There is an alternative. If you do it also together with civil society movements who have contact with each other, assist each other at the level of the people themselves, then there will be the possibility of a change within a country which is going into the direction of more equality and more democracy and more conservation of human rights. To that extent, the past can point into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, for your extensive discussion of the book, and not only the book, also of the lecture. Now, I'm sure that you would like to enter the debate, but I would like to give Adam the opportunity to react. If Jan Pronks tells you you're wrong, but still that you are heading into the right direction, that's about the best compliment you can get in this audience. So I think you're entitled to a few minutes of reaction and explain why perhaps you're not over optimistic.
Colleagues, I want to make 5 points because I thought it was a very powerful critique and a summary. Let me start with, you're right, you're much more pessimistic than I am actually. Now there's two options we have. is take that pessimism and say, okay, let's take a bottle of whiskey and go get drunk. Or say, this is the moment we have, and what do we do with this thing? And figure out a route out of the historical mess that the world finds itself in at this historical juncture. And that's the point. I'm not to the point where, I'm not optimistic to the point where I believe this is going to be an easy struggle. I think the world is in a very dangerous place. And I think that the consequences of where we are will have very, very dangerous consequences. I think Marikana and the massacre in Marikana is a manifestation of that. I think the kidnapping of women in northern Nigeria is a manifestation of this. I think the crazy situation in the middle of Syria and Libya is a manifestation of this. And I think that the world, including the developed world, has to understand that this perspective of somebody, I think, Jan, you used the word, this homeland security mentality, that we can leave the rest of the world and we can border ourselves off as if that's going to survive, I think it's no longer credible. I think even in the streets of New York and London and Paris and Amsterdam, people are saying this is not sustainable. That actually, at some point, somebody breaches those boundaries. And actually, when they breach those boundaries, the consequences are horrific. And those boundaries were not simply breached in 9/11. They've been continually breached every single day and year in the developed world itself. If you look at the kinds of things that are happening on the border of the United States and Mexico, or you look at the fact that last week, Britain is now pondering on the implications of how many of its own children are sitting in the ISIS arm camps in the middle of Baghdad, on the way to Baghdad. I think you're bearing the consequences of this. And the question is, what do we do about it as this thing? And I don't think, unfortunately, we have 150 years in the developing world. I mean, that luxury existed, but we don't have it, actually. Because unlike Europe, you didn't have globalization to this extent. And so another 150 years of repeating the mistakes of Europe will not only destroy Africa, it will destroy the rest of the planet. And that's the historical challenge that we're in this moment. You don't get our act together, there won't be the world for us to live in. And that's the big challenge for the elite, both in the developed and the developing world. So the question is what to do. And so there's two options. There's three options, actually. The one is get drunk and let's wait for the end of the world. The second is do what many of my comrades on the left do, is storm the citadels of power and have a revolution. Neither of which I think are tenable solutions. Or the third is to go back to a very famous man not very far away, Gramsci, in a different epoch, about how do you engage in struggles from within the heart of the system itself. And the most famous analysis and the most famous, I think, usefulness of Gramsci is the ability to suggest reforms that have the logic of snowballing into, over a period of time, transforming the system itself. Now, is this possible in any context? No. But are there historical moments where you use the struggle for reforms as the linchpin for fundamentally transforming society? Is what Gramsci is about. And that's the conceptual tools I try to understand in trying to understand where we are at this historical moment. So this is where we have. Am I optimistic on this thing? No. Am I entirely pessimistic? No. I am saying I'm more optimistic in 2013 than I was in 2006, because there are developments that are globally happening in a way that were not existing in 2006. One is at the heart of imperial power, they are talking about inequality. You know, the President of the United States says, we got to worry about inequality and its consequences. What does he do at the memorial service of Nelson Mandela? He talks about inequality. Now, you know what's the irony? Is he probably hypocritical? Of course, because he's using drones to knocking off people. But the fact that he has to talk about it, the fact that Thomas Piketty can write about inequality and be on the New York bestseller list, suggests something is happening in the world. You know, 10 years ago, the only people who would ever listen to me were people like yourselves in universities. Last week, I was speaking to a bunch of mining executives in the middle of London, arranged by Rothschilds. Now, they probably think I'm talking nonsense 3/4 of the time. But the fact that they want to talk to me suggests that there is a thinking process happening at the heart of power that is different. And I'm not the only one. I can tell you there are lots of others where these kinds of conversations are happening. So something's shifting. And for me, that creates some potential to be slightly more optimistic than I was in 2006. The fact that political power is becoming more fractured in South Africa and counterpower is emerging in the system is an important thing. The fact that you have NUMSA with liberation pedigree, national organizational infrastructure, and the possibility of cash because it controls pension funds, becoming a political alternative is good for everybody, including the ANC, ironically. And so there is a change from what existed in 2006 and 2007. The fact that you have an Irvin Jim who is at the heart of COSATU saying, I've had enough of Jacob Zuma. Whether he's right or wrong is immaterial. That's a change. And the third is on the global economy. Is that actually there is a China. And a China that is competing for power. And I'm not particularly thrilled by the Chinese government. And so I don't want to necessarily this thing. But the fact that you can play off in the middle of South Africa, and this is what I argued in a different this thing, that you can play off China and the United States and Western Europe off against each other to maximize developmental potentials is now something. And sometimes it's perverted and sometimes it's not. But in Tanzania, they're getting concessionary loans for railway lines that were not possible 15 years ago. Because now they're playing the Chinese against the Americans, against the Europeans. And that ability to counterplay power is something that is changing in this world. Whether you like the Chinese or not, they are freaky and frightening sometimes in the way they display power. But the fact that you can play them off against each other is something that we should think so. So for me, I will end by this. Do I think we should wallow in pessimism? No. Because unfortunately, the project of transforming this world, we have to recognize the world for what it is. And the trick about the thing that I think we need to do as analysts is not simply focus on policy, which I think is important, but to understand what structural configurations of power can enable the kinds of policies that we are interested in. And what is the kinds of political action we require to enable those structural configurations of power to emerge. And we do that in whichever setting we are in. So I'll give you an example, and I'll end at this point. I'm a bureaucrat at a university. But what do? I've got a business school. And so last week, I got the Archbishop to convene a meeting with 3 of the mining executive CEOs and AMCU, which is the union leading the platinum strike. And the argument we were saying to them is, to the chiefs of the CEOs, look here, chief, you carry on like this, forget your 17 million package, there won't be any package. You might as well start taking a remuneration amnesty for 2 years because at least you'll be stuck with a 17 million package. And we're speaking to AMCU and saying, look, chief, you're never going to get all of this. You're right that shareholder value between 2001 and 2008 was largely, their shareholders were the main beneficiaries of the platinum boom. But you can't now reverse that in 2014 when the platinum industry is in a crisis. But if you cut a deal and you say the next BEE deal shouldn't go to politicians on the NEC of the ANC, but to employees, now you're rethinking BEE, and you could achieve your pension plans through a rethinking of the issue. And by the way, the CEOs will buy into it, because we said to the CEOs, if you give it to the employees, it's better off, because at least they'll be there for a long period of time. The problem with politicians is they get kicked out every 5 years, and the next group of politicians want their BEE deal. So give it to the employees in the first place, and you're better off, because it's more sustainable. You see, the trick about it is to play with, in whichever setting you are, and to think through how to configure power in all of these little ways. But because it's in that complexity of small actions that reconfigurations of power imagine, and it is those reconfigurations of power that make alternative possibilities happen. And then finally, this is what I say to people across the world, by the way, in the developed world particularly. You can carry on with what you think is going to happen. I tell you, if Africa does exactly what Europe or China did over the last 20 years, you won't have grandchildren, and neither will I. So for your own interest, get with the program. Because that is what the real challenge of our globe confronts. And that, for me, is the message. And there's two options. Either we get it right, or at least somebody will have said, as the world is going down, at least that guy said we'll be in this place. And that's the only thing that we can hope for at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, again. I presume there will be questions, contributions to the debate. Either to Adam, perhaps to Jan too. Do we need microphones? Don't think so, huh? Being recorded, okay, thanks. Then we need microphones, okay. I start here on the left and then I gradually move there to the right, okay?
Okay, I'm not really interested in optimism or pessimism. I don't really think those concepts get us very far. But what I am interested in is why the Human Rights Alliance with Democrats broke down. And I think that one has to recognize that we no longer live in democracies in Western Europe. US is far, far away from a democracy today as any country in the planet, practically. It's just at a higher level of income. I think the notion that somehow Western human rights constituencies have answers right now for anyone else in the planet is very, very far from the truth. I would say it's quite the reverse. Unless we look outside of Europe, North America and the rest, we don't find any solutions to our domestic problems.
Yeah, Jida from ISS. I was just going to say also that it's true, you see that the US and really what used to be called middle class are now all in really a bad situation. And I think you're currently going to see bankers and these types of people, sorry for the language, I call them bankers wankers, but I think it's because also we forget that the bankers of today, who also had the opportunity in the 90s or 2000s to be very young and very achieved at the same time, are the ones who are a different product. You know, they lived in the 80s, they went to school in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So they're already the generation is coming into action that is different than the Reagan or such people.
Maybe I should say something, Professor Dehan. Thank you for inviting us. We're from the South African Embassy. And our ambassador was supposed to attend this session, but he said he cannot make it because he's invited somewhere else. I wanted to agree with Professor Habib when he says the anti-apartheid movement has not been acknowledged, especially in our country. And hence we came up with the exhibition as a South African Embassy, because we realized that the youth or the new generation is not aware of what the anti-apartheid movement has done for the support that they gave South Africa during apartheid times. And so we thought we should come up with the exhibition so that we can showcase it, and then we can take it to South Africa as well in conjunction with the Dutch embassy in South Africa, and so that we can try and inform the youth that this is what the Dutch has done for us during apartheid times. maybe I should say what I need to say during the session when we open the exhibition. I wanted to elaborate more on the exhibition. Thank you.
Now the microphone looks like a whole potato. Bring it to a microphone.
Henry Beuners, ISS. Thank you very much for your well-put lecture. But I was looking at these two slides here on the wall with the cover of your book, 90 minutes long. And the title is Suspended Revolution, Hopes and Perspectives. And I was wondering, during the first part of your lecture, what was you hoping for? Revolution or for the continuation of the suspension of the revolution? After the lecture, I thought, oh, well, if Jan Pronk would have been an author, it would have got the title Hope for Revolution. And now I know we should read this title as Hope for the Suspension, the continuation of the suspension of the revolution. But you didn't talk about revolution much in your talk. So what's wrong with revolution, and why don't you think these political polarization cannot end in revolution?
Thank you very much, Professor Habib. We really enjoyed that. There's a practice sort of political question about South Africa that I have, and another question about your sort of analysis. And let me start with the latter. I've also read the book and I really enjoyed it. I'm still trying to get to grips with it. There's a certain slipperiness in the book that I'm still trying to get a hold of, and it has a little bit to do with the concept of power. I think you're talking about you want to get into the heart of power, the structure, and you want to, within the structure, deal with it. But you never really quite explain what the structure is, because when you deal with structural big terms, capitalism, socialism, you say that those are false debates. Those are, choices that we shouldn't have to make anymore. So your analysis of power leaves me with a more sort of a power of a, or you look at it as a political commentator. Like there's all these different political factions and then these groups, and you know them really well, and you're right in the middle of it, and I find it incredibly interesting. But then the struggle is just to try to understand them, deal with them, but that's not necessarily structural. So I wonder whether you can say a little bit more about that. And the second question is, I think, the role of the EFF. You already mentioned it a little bit, but of course this is quite a big thing. And I mean, there are certain sort of commonalities between what you and they are arguing, but they are doing it in a very, very different way. And they are, they're causing a lot of upheaval at the moment in South Africa. And I was just wondering, from a political commentator point of view, can you say a little bit more about that and then the prospects for EFF into the, to what's going to happen now in terms of the political balance in South Africa? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Go back to Adam Habib.
So that was that's interesting. Let me tackle quickly the what I think are the statements that were made. Really, they weren't really questions around the issue of the human rights. And I think you're right. I think I don't disagree with what you're saying. This is the dilemma we have. I had an engagement with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International invited, largely around Libya and Zimbabwe. And the argument was largely about how the South African government has betrayed its human rights credentials, particularly on the positions it took while it was in the UN Security Council. And basically my argument was with them is that I think while the South African government can be criticized for some of the positions, I think the alternative that you're putting forward is also problematic. Because sometimes you become the unwitting agents of imperial power. And partly it goes back to what Jan had spoken about, is the very nature of NGOs and how they act at firms and how they get funded in how their funding streams happen, and all of that tends to impact on how the positions they took. And I recall, and that's the argument, is how do we get out of this? This idea that if you look at the debate, if you look at Mahmoud Mamdani's book on Darfur, one of the things about this book is a massive attack on mainstream civil society in the developed world. And they have responded to Mahmoud in this kind of way, which says, you're just a friend of autocrats on the continent. And the problem is that that's a false debate. It's a particularly unimaginative debate. Because I think that Mahmoud can be criticized. But he is not an autocrat and he's not a friend of the autocrat. And I think that the problem with Mahmoud is that he can criticize Human Rights Watch or some of the others, but all civil society is not the same. And that what we need to do is have a more nuanced conversation. And there's a false debate, is a kind of dialogue of the deaf that is happening. And how do we transcend that? And that's what I think we need to open up the question. And the reason I said it in the ISS is because I think there's a whole series of people here who confront this debate and debate these issues all the time. There's the issue of the anti-apartheid thing, and I agree with the colleague from the South African embassy. The only thing I will say is that when it goes to South Africa, I think it should be seen by young people. And make sure that it goes to a university and doesn't get stuck in a government department. But if it goes to a university, fantastic. I think that that's it. And if you've got a university, that's fine. And if you don't have a university, I'm volunteering mine. So feel free to approach me if that's the case. On the suspended revolution, I think that's right. Firstly, just let me tell you how the title emerged. Frankly, I had very little to do with the title. I was muscled by the publishers who insisted on having a title. And so this was a messy compromise, if you like. But you're right, it's not about revolution. It's about trying to think through. It's a Gramscian mechanism on how to look through dealing with a strategy, what I call in the book, the conceptualization of structural reforms that in their collection begin to have revolutionary effects, dramatically transformative effects. And it uses the example of, by the way, Joe Slovo. Joe Slovo, in the early 1990s, we were confronted with the stalemate in the South African negotiations, largely because the idea was how to get rid of how to make a breakthrough in the political impasse in the negotiations. And Joe Slovo put forward the notion of concessions to the apartheid state. And part of the concessions to the apartheid state was effectively the sunset clause, which is respect the contracts of apartheid civil servants, respect their pension rights, respect all of those kinds of things. And the idea was that we couldn't make a breakthrough in the negotiations because there was no incentive. And what it was heavily opposed by the ANC and broadly in the anti-apartheid movement. But one of the biggest things that concession did is it unraveled the stalemate. Because ironically what it did is the biggest power and leverage that the National Party had in those negotiations was control over the civil service and control over military power. And when you made the concession around respecting on the sunset clause, those civil servants no longer needed the NP to protect their power. They could get that thing directly in partnership from Madiba himself. And one of the interesting things about this is when the NP pulls out of government in 1996, it doesn't derail the transition. Because a whole series of apartheid generals and this thing said, we can negotiate directly with the ANC. We don't need the NP as an interlocutor in this conversation. It was a reform, but it was a reform that had a snowballing logic that fundamentally weakened the leverage of the National Party in that context. And so the question about thinking that through is I don't think Slovo had Gramsci in mind when he thought it through. But there is a notion that was constructed by John Saul in the early 1990s, structural reform, in an article in the New Left Review. And it's the use of that and trying to understand what does structural reform mean to be able to create the kinds of snowballing logic. And that's what this book is essentially about. Now, why do I think revolution won't happen? Well, because firstly, I don't think it's going to happen in South Africa. I think revolutions happen under particular conditions. Large-scale alienation, South Africa's got that. But what South Africa also needs for revolutions to happen is a political agency, an institutional mechanism that can bring together this multiplicity of spontaneous movements in society into a political project that would largely overthrow the state and largely overthrow capital. And I don't think that exists in South Africa. I think even in those, having spoken to the people in those struggles, there isn't the argument to overthrow the state. That's not what is motivating them. What is motivating them is to get a fair share of the spoils. And so I don't think the subjective prerequisite or the political agency exists. I think despite all of the weaknesses of the ANC is still 62%, it still wins 62%, and it still captures the imagination of the South African population in ways that no other agency does. And so I don't think the political conditions exist for this thing. And I respond, by the way, the speech that I would have given if I read a speech is entitled South Africa Approaching a Moment of Reckoning. And it talks about Moletsi Mbeki's suggestion that South Africa is going to have a revolution in 2020 because the mining industry, the gas coming out of the mining industry will die down and you won't be able to buy off the electorate. And I said then and I said now, I don't think the timeline is there, but I do think we run the risk. And what this book is about, ironically, it doesn't look like it, given its yellow cover. It looks like it came out from Kosatu Publishing House. But one of the things it is, and that's why I speak to players like Big Capital and say, hey, you run the risk of two things. If you don't do this, if you don't play, if you don't start looking towards some notion of a social democracy, you truly run the risk of a moment of reckoning coming. And maybe the agency doesn't exist now, but the agency can develop for a revolution itself. And for me, it's a plea to the elite to understand the consequences of what they're going to sow, unless they move towards a social democracy. Now you might ask, why do you want to go towards a social democracy and not a revolution itself? Because revolutions follow long periods of decimation, long periods of fracture, and frankly, at this moment, I'd rather take social democracy than have this thing, because I think it would be a significant advance. And you might think that social democracy is being eroded here, but mark me, living in Amsterdam or The Hague, and the erosion of neoliberalism is fundamentally different to the manifestation of neoliberalism in Marikana. The consequences are fundamentally different. And yes, neoliberalism manifests as faces here. But as I said, people don't drown in feces in the Netherlands. They do in South Africa. That's the manifestation of inequality. And let's be honest, you don't get Marikana. And so there are erosions, but what they mean in these different contexts. And so I think an advance, a social democracy will be a fundamental advance. And then finally on structural power, I think you're right, absolutely, that the fundamental challenge of South Africa is that we inherit a condition that is structural, and that power is itself immersed in those very historical structures. The energy complex and mining complex, the energy industrial complex, and how the mining industry was configuring the energy industrial complex, and how that energy industrial complex is at the heart of how capitalist power is constructed. How the state has begun and become complicit in that. And how the global order, in a context, at least for the 1990s, of unipolar power, and how that manifested itself. And what this is a recognition of that, but says, how do you undermine that? And it says that you're going to undermine that in a Gramscian sense by a series of engagements that are structural, but they have that snowballing logic. And so that's why the book talks about China and the rise of China in a positive sense. Not because I like the Chinese or the political project, but its mere presence changes and transforms power in that global order. The mere rise of, there's a big discussion on BEE and how to use BEE funds in small business enterprises, because that gets employment going. But if you get employment going in small business enterprises, you reconfigure power and the way the South African economy is constructed. And you create competing alternatives. And so he talks about that. And so there's a whole series of, if you like, engagements in chapter 7 around what you should do and what alternatives are, about trying to think, what are the small actions? Now, you're right. It isn't a thesis on power. But what it is on is what are the issues that collectively can begin to erode the structural configurations of power as they are. I did think that one of the things you're right on, I'm not entirely sure that I say everything the EFF says. They would be horrified to think that. I think that there is a logic of the EFF is in its essence that I would, that is implicit in the book. It's about erosion of it. I'm not so sure nationalization of the gold mining sector, the platinum sector is the answer, by the way, partly because I don't think we have the administrative capacities. If we have so much of corruption, my view is get the bloody local municipality working before you decide to start running a mining company. When you do that, we can talk about the mining company, but let's get the really small thing, get the bloody lights and fix the potholes before you want to start talking about the mining company. Now the EFF's position is, no, we want the mining company. And I fear that. But the point is, in its essence, I think you're right. I might differ with policy objectives that they have and all of that. But I think that this is the challenge of the EFF. And this is what I think the EFF brings to the fore. The EFF brings to the fore the potential that South Africans are beginning to look at alternatives. And those alternatives are not to the right of the ANC, to the left of the ANC. And that's why I'm intrigued by NUMSA. Because the NUMSA, despite some of its pretensions, is a much more substantive emergence of that logic. And ironically, my argument is that should it emerge, it would have a dramatic impact on the ANC itself. It will force the ANC to become responsive to those questions in ways and start asking the hard questions. Now, why do I think they vote? What do I think is the EFF's prospects? Not much. They got very irritated when I said this. I think that when South Africans were confronted, they find it very difficult to vote for the DA. And I'm not talking about black South Africans, I'm talking about progressive South Africans. And so the question then emerges is, who do you vote for if you want to send a message to the ANC? So they vote for, if you like, the EFF, the prodigal son of the ANC, because they know it sends a message to the ANC itself. And so the 11% in Gauteng is a major shake-up call to the ANC, because it's a powerful message to them, you can't take us for granted. And that's what the message was. Do I think that they'll vote for the EFF in 2016 when we're doing local government elections? I'm not so sure. I think South Africans said, we'll trust Julius Malema to create mayhem in the national parliament because that we need to wake up those guys. But we're not about to make him mayor of Johannesburg. That doesn't work. They don't have that much faith in Julius Malema. And so, in a kind of a paradoxical way, I think the EFF's success is a message to power that don't take us for granted, rather than an endorsement of the EFF as a coherent alternative. And that's the thing that I think is the issue about that election. And so when people say that South Africans vote sillily, and they simply defined by race, I think they're fundamentally wrong. I think South Africans think through very powerfully how they're voting and how they're sending messages. And I'll end off here. The other interesting thing about the EFF is there's a number of PhD students from WITS on the EFF national this thing, which creates all kinds of grumbles by government when they say, what are you teaching in the middle of WITS University? But the interesting thing is I had a conversation with some of them, which is fascinating. And I said to them, explain to me, man, some of these are some of our brightest young scholars. I said, what are you doing in the EFF? And I think the argument is much about this thing. It's about, they don't see Malema as the manifestation of it. They see the EFF as the mechanism by which to open up a series of conversations that we're unable and we're not on the political agenda in South Africa. And I think that that's fascinating. Now, whether they succeed or not, and whether they think they can manipulate Malema is, I think, problematic, because the communists and the left thought they were doing that to Zuma, and they learned that lesson heavily. But I think that's the interesting question. So if you ask me what the EFF is, I think it's an instrument to send a message to power rather than an endorsement of an alternative in its own right. Thanks.
Time for a drink, I would say. But, Jan, would you like to have one final remark? At least you are a discussant, so you're entitled.
No, I should not have the last word. So if I say something, you have to answer. But, no. The most important dilemma which you are putting forward in the book is the question, can you lift the people from the underclass without constraining the upper class? That's the issue. And you have described changes in social economic policy making in South Africa during the last 20 years. And you came to the conclusion that although those changes took place, still it is not possible. It has not been done. Anyway, not adequate. And there have been made very serious efforts. You are very fair to policymakers. And I think that's the main question if you speak about not revolution, because the book is not on revolution, the book is on transformation. And I didn't use the word revolution, but transformation. And if you speak about transformation, then the main issue is, indeed, will it be possible in South Africa, in the world as a whole, in the global system at the moment, to lift the poor out of their situation without constraining the rich, the powerful. And I think it's more difficult than in the past, because all the powerful are being linked to each other in the framework of that capitalist world society. And they also do have political and military power at the moment, through which they can prevent possible changes. Now, that is pessimism. Okay. If I would be a politician still, that would have been my thought, my speech also, because you have to show people that it's still possible. But you are starting the book also with the question of the statement by Marx. It is, as a philosopher, not only necessary to interpret the world in various ways, but to change it. I did interpret it now. I'm no longer changing it. And in my interpretation, I'm always meeting accumulations of power which are always able to stop groundswell movements, etc. That is making me a little bit pessimistic.
No, Adam, you're fine, then otherwise you start repeating yourself. I would like to thank both of you. Of course, Adam first, and then Jan. And in that respect, your contributions to debate were very interesting and made us think. And in that respect, I can only, give you eternal fame here at the Institute by thanking you. But I have a small gift for Adam as well, a photo book on The Hague, because we are not only discussing South Africa's revolution, or not, suspended or still to come, but also collaboration between Wits University and the ISS. So we hope that this book brings you to The Hague more often. You've seen it already. It's a very nice, beautiful historical city, and let us thank you with this book and then ask you to return as soon as possible. Thank you, Adam. And then I invite you for drinks in the atrium. And there is an exhibit, as we already told you, on the Dutch-South African relations, and especially with respect to the anti-apartheid movement. Now, upstairs we don't have a microphone, and it might be a bit difficult to understand each other. So I would like to invite the first secretary of the South African Embassy here in The Hague to explain us a little bit more with respect to the exhibition and invite to stand up. Yeah, do it here because we don't have a microphone there.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I will put it the way that Professor Habib puts it. As I've mentioned earlier, Ambassador Hossein cannot make it. He's attending another function in Amsterdam. So he said, yes, and for Professor Habib to know, Ambassador Hossein is going back home for good on Monday. So we're waiting for another ambassador to take over, but we don't know who's coming and when he's coming. So as I was mentioning earlier on regarding the exhibition, this was triggered by the fact that one time the ambassador attended a function here in The Hague. And one of a young political leader in South Africa, when he was making a speech, he mentioned that he attended the World Cup in South Africa 2010, and he was supporting the Orange, the Dutch national team. And so he was dressed up in orange, and one of his friends was saying, hey, how come you are supporting these people because they brought, apartheid in our country? And so when that leader was saying that in front of that audience, it was quiet, and everybody was, wow, what kind of statement is this? And so Ambassador thought then, it means therefore that these young leaders do not understand the support that we received from the Netherlands regarding the anti-apartheid, the support against apartheid in South Africa. And so he thought that we need to try and make them understand, but how do we do that? And so when we are asked by the department, in fact, that was even before the department asked us to come up with a concept to celebrate 20 years of democracy. So he thought maybe because he met this guy, Mr. Kirschrunga, you know Kirschrunga, who is an ANC archivist. And when he got to the embassy, when he arrived at the embassy, he saw some pictures that he thought that there might be original pictures, and someone must have taken these pictures. He tried to find this person and eventually found Kirk Shirunga. And so the ambassador approached Kirk Shirunga, because we have a good relationship with him, to say, is it not possible for you to get us an exhibition on the anti-apartheid movement activities, so that we can take this exhibition around the Netherlands to institutions of higher learning especially, so that we can educate the young leaders or young students about what the Netherlands did for us during those days. But what the ambassador did as well was to approach the Dutch embassy to say to them, hey, we have this idea. And South Africans, we know, especially the young generation, they don't understand the support that we received from the Netherlands. So it would be a good idea to have this exhibition and to take it around the universities in South Africa so that we can educate, including in our Department of Foreign Affairs, so that the young diplomats can have an understanding of what the Netherlands did for us. So we came up with the exhibition, and the Dutch embassy was supportive of it. They contributed some money, and we also contributed some money. And so what we did was duplicating this exhibition. It is going to South Africa, to the Dutch embassy, and they will take it around universities in South Africa, including Parliament and including our Department of Foreign Affairs. We've already taken the exhibition to the municipality here in The Hague. It has been to the Foreign Ministry here. We've taken it to the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. Now we have it here. We're taking it to one of the museums here in The Hague. But we're also trying to get it to other municipalities here in the Netherlands. So that also, but the challenge that we thought we would have is, because the exhibition is in English, some of the people approached us and said, can't you have this in Dutch as well? So what we did, we approached SA Tourism, so they will print flyers of the exhibition. That was the ambassador's idea, so that we can have flyers in Dutch as well. So this is where we are with the exhibition. And by the way, we're the only embassy, South African embassy, that has come up with this concept for this in celebrating of the 20 years of democracy.
Thank you. So what we actually do now is to declare the exhibit officially open.
Yes, thank you, yes. And yeah, we need to thank your institution for allowing us to host it.
We thank you for offering us. And so may I invite you upstairs, have a drink and look at the exhibit. If you are old enough, you might recognize yourself on the pictures. But that, of course, is when you're old as this particular man, perhaps Jan Pronk too, and some other in the audience. And the others, please read and admire. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for contributing to the discussion. And please join us upstairs. Thank you again. We really love to listen to you and also to you. Great debate.
I mean, there's a series. By the way, this is not the only conversation.
No, of course.
There's a whole series of people.
But at least South African or global.
From South African and global.
Okay.
It is a suggestion. I know lots of surveys where happens. Conversation was not very good.
Okay.
Inequality and its consequences and that kind of some of it. Some of the parts of it. So, you know, I mean, there is the sort of conversations that are happening now that never happened.
Yeah, definitely not pre-08.
Yeah.